Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Cambridge Negotiation Institute Roundtable Expert Facilitators on their craft. My name is Krista DeBoer. I'm one of the founders and a principal of CNI, and I'm also joined here today by my colleague, CNI co-founder, principal, and senior fellow at Harvard Law School, Bob Bordone. He's up here in the window with me. For those of you who are new to CNI, CNI is actually a relatively new initiative with the purpose of offering valuable courses right now, in web format, and hopefully at some point very soon, live courses related to negotiation, conflict resilience, leadership, and challenging conversations. In addition, we are committed to building a community of practitioners and scholars and teachers who are interested in advancing and building the field of negotiation, leadership, and conflict resilience, who are interested in learning from each other and ultimately making a difference in the world. So to this end, we will be offering panel sessions through our CNI Roundtable series regularly throughout the year, free of charge, where we will be gathering leading experts who will share their insights and their experience and research that we believe will be useful to spark conversation and practice and action. Today, we are thrilled to have assembled people from all over the world, including from throughout the US, Canada, Brazil, Argentina, Denmark, Kenya, Peru, to name a few. And I'm also equally excited by the world-class panel we've assembled here today. Our experts bring varied and meaningful experiences to the table, and they're here to share their insights and advice on the topic of facilitating, especially in the context of heightened polarization or deeply emotional subjects. So I will briefly introduce each panelist, but I will also paste a link to their full bios in the chat box for those of you who are interested and like to read more about them. I have asked each of our four panelists to share their insights with us in about 10 to 12 minutes. And given the breadth of experience that they have, this is kind of a gargantuan task, but they've agreed to do it. So after the panelists speak, we will have some time for conversation and questions that will come from you via the chat box. We'll then have a final word and wrap up at 1:30 p.m. Eastern. Because we had a waiting list for today's webinar, we will also be recording this event with the intent of making all or at least a portion of it available on our website later. So without further ado, let me turn to our first panelist, Toby Berkman, to kick us off. Toby is a friend, a colleague, and our very own CNI consultant. He's a senior associate at the Consensus Building Institute and affiliated faculty at the program on negotiation at Harvard Law School. Toby has been facilitating dialogue and mediating complex public disputes for more than a decade. And he's worked with institutions like the US State Department, US Department of Defense, United Nations, and the World Bank. Toby, thank you for being here.
Great, thanks so much, Krista. I'm really grateful for the chance to be here and be included among this wonderful, fantastic group of esteemed panelists, and also just looking at some of the faces and names in the participant list. I see some familiar folks, so really nice to see you all. I, as Krista suggested, I work in the field of public dispute resolution as a facilitator, primarily at an organization called the Consensus Building Institute, or CBI. And so for those of you who may be less familiar with the field, what does that mean in practice? Well, I work on a range of issues of public policy or public issues that often generate controversy, where there are multiple different groups that have perspectives on those issues. So that could be anything from, working with a government agency around a renewable energy project. And so maybe the government agency has perspectives on what should happen with that project. Maybe there's a developer, there might be community members that have various perspectives. And so our job is to try to bring those stakeholders together, develop a process where they can have conversations that are productive, and hopefully move these issues forward in a way that makes everyone better off. So, could be that kind of renewable energy project I mentioned, or it could be working with a town around a plan they're developing for sustainable development, or it could be working nationally on a challenging policy issue, bringing together experts and various groups that do work in affordable housing and trying to come up with a plan for how they could collaborate more effectively together. So CBI, or the organization where I work, the vision of the organization is a world where the most challenging, difficult issues are solved through collaboration, and that's what we try to do. And I want to just say at the outset that I love my job. I believe in our work. I believe in the positive impact that it has, and I certainly believe in that vision of a world where our most difficult challenges are solved by collaboration. And just how wonderful would it be if we lived in a world where truly the most deep, challenging issues that our society faces are solved through all stakeholders coming together, finding a way to have productive and civil dialogue and advance those issues in ways that actually make everyone better off. So having said all that by way of introduction, I also want to note that these past few months have, for me, been something of as I imagine for many of you, an opportunity to reflect on my practice in light of the heightened attention to racial justice issues in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and others. We at CBI have been engaging in lots of conversations around these issues. I've been thinking a lot about them personally. In particular, what does it mean to engage in equity-informed facilitation? What does it mean to be an anti-racist facilitator or an anti-misogynist facilitator? In particular, when you think about the term anti-racism and what that means, demanding a departure from neutrality, right? There's an observation among thinkers in this space that to be, just not racist in a society where we're swimming in racism, systemic racism of various kinds. It's the water that we swim in, right? That is in fact a form of racism, right? So what does it actually mean to be impartial, but also an anti-racist or an anti-misogynist? I want to suggest that the answers to that question aren't obvious, and there have certainly been a lot of people thinking about equity-informed facilitation over the years. It's not a new topic, and yet I also think there's a lot more that we as a field can do to think seriously and use this moment to really dig deeply and reflect on our practices and get better. So there's been a lot of research in this space around private sector mediation, which is obviously different from what we do, public sector dispute resolution. But I want to suggest it sort of raises some questions. It is not, I want to say there's not conclusive research in this space, sort of one way or the other in terms of the impact of issues like race and gender on equity in mediation processes. But the research is certainly not positive for the field, right? There's some evidence that people of color and women do worse in mediation. Again, it's not conclusive. There's much stronger evidence, I want to suggest, that people of lower socioeconomic backgrounds do worse in mediation. And when you translate that to arbitration, the findings, I think, are much more robust and stronger. Now, of course, we work in public dispute resolution, which is different. We're not just dealing with two parties in a court-affiliated context. We're dealing with much broader, bigger public disputes, public issues. And so we might be able to say, okay, well, our processes are different because we are bringing in multiple stakeholders, we're broadening the table, we're being inclusive. We are not just having sort of a narrow perspective on the problem. That makes our work sort of intrinsically different and potentially more equitable. And yet there's actually some evidence and research suggesting that that is not the case. There was just this week an article in the New York Times in the Upshot, basically citing some research suggesting that, that within public dispute resolution, in city planning in particular, participatory democracy has led to more, not less, unequal outcomes. So, reflecting on why might that be the case? Well, if you are running, as we often do, these public processes, right, who is most able to show up to those meetings? Who is most likely to be there and have their voices raised? Well, often these are meetings that could be taking place on a weekday during the day, right? It's going to be people who can get out of work or maybe aren't working because they have the means or they're retired. My experience has often been that it tends to be people who skew slightly older and slightly wealthier than the typical people in those conversations. Excuse me, by the older and wealthier than the people who are impacted by the issues or might have a stake in the issues. You can also imagine even just beyond who can show up to these meetings, who is going to have the means to make their voices clearly inserted into the conversation in an effective way. It's going to the people who tend to be more well off, have more capacity to engage effectively in these dialogues. So, you know, none of this is at all to question the good faith of the clients that we work, who I think with whom we work, who I think genuinely want to have inclusive, equitable processes. It's just to name that this is sort of a systemic challenge that we as a field face. So just in terms of, you know, clients, I think being really forward thinking on this issue often, you know, we work with fantastic clients at CBI. I can just think of one example. We were working on developing a vision, a plan around the use of ocean resources in the Northeast. And our client was amazing. He would go every week to docks, to fishing communities up and down the East Coast and engage in conversations literally on the docks with fishers in order to make sure that their voices were part of our conversation, because this client knew that without that kind of active outreach, the conversations that we were having would not sufficiently include those voices. So we have incredible clients, incredible folks trying to be equity minded. And yet I think if we are working in a field that relies on people like that client to go out to docks every week, right, to get those voices at the table, well, I think it sort of raises some questions and some challenges around how we need to be doing this work and what it calls for. So I want to suggest, just to sort of spur thinking and spur some conversation, 3 equations that I think sort of get at this challenge and suggest some potential best practices for facilitators. And again, these are conversations that are ongoing. I'm interested in hearing the perspectives of others on this call, but just to sort of get some thinking going, 3 equations. The first equation is equity does not equal an equal voice at the table, which is to say it is not enough just to give people an equal opportunity to speak and share their perspectives at the dialogue table. The whole question of setting the table, what does that table look like? What are the questions being asked? Who is at the table? What is the format? If you are not involving in an equity-minded way all of the folks who have an interest in that conversation and getting them to have an opportunity to share their perspectives and have it utilized upstream from the actual table, right, then that table is going to potentially reinforce problematic equity issues. Another equation, inclusion does not equal an open door. It is not enough to simply say, we're having this meeting, everyone is welcome, all voices can come to the table. If you do that, you're going to get predominantly the voices that have the means to get there. So inclusion means actively going out the door and finding stakeholders and getting their perspectives. That, of course, requires resources, right, which is a challenge. A third equation, diversity is not a luxury. And I mean diversity of facilitators is not a luxury. So one element of the research that I didn't talk about that is actually quite clear is that when you have groups of stakeholders that are of mixed racial or gender or other backgrounds, and the facilitator is from one of those groups, the people from the other group will trust the facilitator less and trust the process less. This to me suggests it is an imperative that our field become more diverse and have facilitators that reflect the communities in which we are often doing our work in terms of our background and identities. And then the final equation, I think, is sort of the overarching equation that maybe will spur some thinking. and that is neutrality does not equal neutrality. In a system that is unequal, neutral is can in fact be a form of upholding the status quo, of bias against less powerful groups. And so we need to think seriously about not just neutrality, not just impartiality, but multi-partiality, and how to make that a reality. So thanks, I'll leave it there, and I look forward to questions and conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Toby. You have given us a lot to think about. I'm sure we'll be revisiting these questions as the session goes on here. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our next panelist, Suzanne Ghais. Suzanne is a mediator, a facilitator, a trainer, and an author with 30 years in the field of conflict resolution, including international peacemaking and peace building. In addition to her practice, she also teaches courses at American University School of International Service and for the University of Denver's Corbell School of International Studies. She's also the author of Extreme Facilitation, Guiding Groups Through Controversy and Complexity. Thanks for being here today, Suzanne.
Thank you so much, Krista. It's wonderful to be with all of you. And Toby, as usual, is a hard act to follow. I'm going to tell a story of a facilitation job that I had that I think was quite extreme. And I'm going to dwell on a few points where I succeeded and one point where I failed, and look at lessons learned from all of those. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had managed the National Bison Range. This is a national wildlife refuge in Montana. Since the time it was purchased, and I put those in air quotes because it was purchased collectively from Native Americans by the government of Theodore Roosevelt in 1908. Now, all national wildlife refuges are managed by the Fish and Wildlife Service. But there's also a law that was enacted in 1994 called the Tribal Self-Governance Act, and it allows indigenous tribes to apply to manage public lands to which they have a cultural, historical, or geographical connection. So on the tribe side, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes, or CSKT, occupies the Flathead Reservation in Montana. And the National Bison Range sits like a little donut hole smack in the middle of that reservation. The tribes have a definite spiritual connection to the bison, and by the way, the CSKT also has a highly professional Department of Natural Resources. So the CSKT applied to manage the Bison Range through what's called an annual funding agreement, but we can just call it an agreement. And this required the Fish and Wildlife Service and the CSKT to work together to manage the Bison Range. So the first time this happened was 2005, and it only lasted into 2006. Things did not go well. So by the time I was contacted by Elena Gonzalez at the Department of Interior. She called me and another facilitator, John Townsend. At that point, the status was that some white employees of the Fish and Wildlife Service had filed claims against Native Americans, claiming race discrimination against the white folks. Clearly just the tip of the iceberg, much more going on there. So part of what was going on was that many folks in the Fish and Wildlife Service were hostile to having anyone other than themselves, federal employees, manage a national wildlife refuge. And this was not without some basis, because there is a law saying that all national wildlife refuges are controlled by the Fish and Wildlife Service. However, that service is part of the Department of Interior. And lawyers at the department's headquarters in Washington told us that as long as there was a refuge manager representing the Fish and Wildlife Service, nominally in charge of the Bison Range, all of the rest of the staff and management of the Bison Range could be CSKT employees, and thereby fulfilling the Tribal Self-Governance Act of their control of this national treasure. Indeed, there were arguably not two, but three parties to this conflict. So most personnel at the Department of Interior headquarters were actually favorable to the tribes managing the Bison Range and to sort of handing over the major control of it to the tribes under the Tribal Self-Governance Act. So there was as much of a split between the Fish and Wildlife Service and the higher ups at Interior as there was between the service and the CSKT. So for the moment, I'm going to skip to the end of the story. John Townsend and I co-facilitated a process in which these two entities, the CSKT and Fish and Wildlife, negotiated a new agreement in which they formed a joint management team comprising two Fish and Wildlife officials, including the role of the range manager, so to fulfill the law about national wildlife refuges, and two CSKT officials. And they did amazingly in developing trust, restoring trust, and this management team functioned really as a well-oiled machine from the beginning of this new agreement that we facilitated, so 2008, to 2010, and I'll come back to what happened in 2010. So now let me tell stories of a few key moments along the way. First was in the early stages, when we were doing extensive individual and small group interviews trying to get the lay of the land, so to speak, literally and figuratively. I was in the office of Dean Rundle, who is a Fish and Wildlife official who ended up becoming the lead negotiator for that agency. And I strongly sensed that, you know, he was guarded, he was stiff, he was saying the minimum in response to my questions. So I detected distrust, maybe even hostility towards us facilitators from folks in his agency, and he was no exception. So as I was going through my prepared questions, I finally said to him, I sense that you don't trust me. And at that moment, his tone changed from that rigid and guarded to kind of softer, more relaxed, a little more open. And he said, look, it's not that we don't trust you, it's who hired you, because we had been hired by someone in Interior, broadly, not Fish and Wildlife specifically. And he proceeded to ask me a few questions about who specifically had engaged my services and what instructions we were under and so forth. And I answered honestly. And from that point forward, our relationship was fine, actually a very good working relationship. And so a lesson there that I learned is, it kind of got two parts of it. One is be willing to be vulnerable, to say, I feel like you don't trust me. That's opening yourself up a little bit. And also to name the dynamic that you observe. Just naming it is one of the most powerful tools that a facilitator has. Often you don't have to solve a problem going on in the dynamics in a group or even directly in your own interactions, but just name the dynamic. And the participants will often fix it for themselves from there. So another moment was also in the early stages. There was a lot of prep work that happened before we found ourselves in front of the combined group. So after our assessment, but before any actual facilitated negotiation sessions. So the tribes, the CSKT, wanted our facilitation, and the Fish and Wildlife Service did not. They were opposed. And this is a common dynamic, that the more powerful entity wants to keep out any potentially meddlesome third parties, whereas the weaker party, which in this case was the tribe, the Confederated Tribes, sees a third party as maybe a potential ally or at least someone who will help level the playing field. And so what do? We've got one side that wants this, one side that doesn't. So we decided to accept, for at least the moment, the objection to our facilitating a negotiation, and instead hosted a kind of talks about talks session. And to this much, the Fish and Wildlife Service did agree. So this turned out to be a 2-day dialogue. Day one of it was sort of sharing general perspectives, identifying interests. And the second day was devoted to negotiating ground rules, protocols for a potential future negotiation. And at the end of that 2 days, the Fish and Wildlife Service actually did come around and accept our facilitation. So the lesson here is start where the participants are. Start where they are. As a facilitator, it is not your job to win an argument. You're there instead to serve a group. So you might provide choices, but the group provides the decisions. So we started with where they were, and gradually they saw the value and are continuing to provide services for them. I should mention, by the way, at this point, that the hardest work of this whole gig was prior to the beginning of actual substantive negotiations. The assessment, getting people on board, getting those procedural agreements in place, all of that was really the hard stuff, and the rest unfolded relatively smoothly. So those were a couple moments where I think we were successful. And now I'd like to come to a failure. In addition to the 2 or 3 parties, depending on how you count, that I mentioned, so the tribes, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Department of Interior leadership, there was another, an association called Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, or by the acronym PEER. PEER had been agitating against a new partnership agreement between the Fish and Wildlife Service and the tribes. They felt even more strongly than Fish and Wildlife Service employees did that the management of the Bison Range belonged solely to federal employees. Now, everyone were directly involved. So the service, the CSKT, Interior, I mean, at least once we had done some initial trust building, all the people directly involved agreed that PEER should be kept out, and that they seemed opposed to the tribe's involvement in a way that struck many folks as racist. PEER was shrill, they seemed like troublemakers. I now regret that we excluded them, and here's why. I now think we could have found some place for them in the process, maybe not direct parties to a negotiation, but some kind of consultative role, some way to, in a structured, formal way, bring them into the process, to have a voice in it, to consult, to influence, to do something. So what happened instead? Well, once the new agreement was reached, PEER successfully challenged it in court on what was essentially a technicality, saying that the Fish and Wildlife Service, this gets a little complicated. Those of you who know environmental law will follow this easily, but others may not. But the charge was that the Fish and Wildlife Service had not correctly followed the National Environmental Policy Act. This is the law that requires environmental impact statements. Specifically, that they hadn't followed the procedure for getting a categorical exemption, that they hadn't quite precisely implemented the grounds for the categorical exemption from having to do an environmental impact statement. Now, the CSKT and Fish and Wildlife Service managed to recover from this setback. They had built so much trust and cooperation by that point that they came back together on their own, and this was after I was now gone from the scene, and John was gone from the scene as well. They negotiated a new agreement and jointly undertook an environmental assessment to fulfill the newly clarified legal requirement. But meanwhile, the joint management of the range was suspended, and lots of tribal employees lost their jobs. So it was painful in the interim. The lesson to me here was clear, that whoever you most want to exclude is probably precisely who you should include, because if excluded, they will become spoilers. And in this case, they did successfully spoil for a time the beautifully negotiated outcome. So to summarize the lessons learned from this very challenging facilitation, and I don't need to tell all you the depth of distrust between indigenous tribes in the United States and the federal government due to an extremely painful history of broken promises. So lessons learned here, number one, name the dynamics that you observe, just as I named the distrust towards me that I observed. Start with where the participants are. You're not forcing anyone to do anything or winning any debates. And number three, be inclusive. Include those whom you might be most inclined to exclude. So I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. Next, I am delighted to introduce Matt Thompson. Matt has worked for over 30 years in the areas of conflict resolution, diversity, and cultural competency. And he's worked with large regional banking institutions, higher education institutions, major teaching hospitals, community and nonprofit agencies. Matt has also been the Director of Staff Diversity at MIT and was the Director of Affirmative Action and Multicultural Relations at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. He's on the panel of neutrals at the Mediation Group and is also an affiliate of Interaction Institute for Social Change based in Boston. Thanks for being here, Matt.
Sure, it's indeed a pleasure. Oops, yeah, I'm open. Okay, good enough. Wow, my colleagues have just blown me away. They've got some wonderful things here. When I look back at my own past and how these things have unfolded for me, these levels of diversity and equity and inclusion over the years, I got started in this work way back when it was still affirmative action. And to see it evolve, and then I remember when Roosevelt Thomas introduced the whole term of diversity, and he talked about, you know, the salad bowl look and so forth. So this evolutionary process has been something, and to finally get to the point where we begin to talk about not only diversity, but equity and inclusion, and now finally racial justice and white supremacy. It has been an amazing time and an evolutionary period in our lives. These are all ringing true to me, for me, especially because just dealing with clients yesterday and this morning, some of these points were coming out that were presented by my colleagues. Dealing with one client that works at the grassroots level with young people most impacted by, you know, their interactions with the police and so forth. They deal with young people who are, you know, homeless, who are in the juvenile justice system, or who are in foster care and have had their troubles, you know, aligning within society. They're teaching young people how to learn to work together, how to learn to be responsible within their job processes and so forth. That's the core of what they do, and some very beautiful, wonderful people have come together to create this company that helps train them. And naturally, as an organization, they have become hierarchical. Well, when you look at the hierarchy, it was started by three very well-meaning, well-intended, and responsible white people. However, as it has fostered over a period of time, their leadership is still predominantly white. Well, they have approached these issues of equity and inclusion. They've been doing it for the last couple of years. They didn't wait for the last few weeks or last few months. They've been working at this. So the tensions have been there, and dispelling things, dispelling the standards, starting to look at how unconscious biases rise in the work that you do as a leader and within an organization, and recognizing that vague, how could you call it, that vague mix of when the two come together, when organization meets, you know, the interpersonal side of things. And they're starting to recognize, you know, that two people facing the same things, having different backgrounds and different experiences, will come out of it very differently, or how you perceive the people who are doing these things. For you, your own unconscious biases, your own filters that you use, how they come forward in terms of working together. So how they collectively manage the young people they're primarily intending to serve, and how they collectively manage the managers and the leaders within the organization itself has evolved to a point where they are starting to ask these questions, and people are open to, how am I doing? What do I need? Starting to break it down to, I need to look at this both at an organizational level and an interpersonal level. And in facilitation, what one finds is when you begin to approach these issues of where systemic racism may be coming up, it immediately goes to the interpersonal side of most people that you're talking with. but it's a question of understanding that, yes, you're right to look at that, and you also need to look at a systemic piece, or it's not just exclusively the systemic piece. It's not an either or, it's a both and that we have to look at both sides of this as we do the work. You've heard enough about my background. I don't need to go any more, and those are broad concepts. So in order to help us get back on time, I'm just going to turn it back over to Krista now. So.
Thank you, Matt. Our final panelist today, I'm pleased to introduce, is Susan Podziba. Susan has been a public policy mediator for more than 25 years. Her clients have included U.S. Departments of Commerce, Defense, Education, Energy, Health and Human Services, Interior, Labor, U.S. EPA, U.S. Institute of Peace, and the United Nations, just to name a few. Susan has taught graduate seminars on public policy and negotiations at MIT and Harvard Law School, and she currently lectures and consults internationally. Susan is also the author of Civic Fusion, Mediating Polarized Public Disputes. Susan, welcome.
Thank you, Krista. And thank you to you and Bob for the invitation to participate in this session today. You've heard from my colleagues about different aspects of mediation and facilitation, what it's been used for, what it's been able to accomplish, and what it requires. And I've learned a lot. I hope that everyone here has learned as well. What I'd like to talk about is process design. And in the context of how we might imagine using public policy mediation as a strategy for systemic change in policing. Black Lives Matter has yielded many symbolic successes, such as the removal of flags and statues of the Confederacy, new mural and art in cities around the country. And it's also brought about, in my opinion, some remarkable legislative changes in a very quick time. There have been changes in policing budgets in many cities around the country. And so we could say already that some parts of the country are bending the arc of the moral universe toward justice and a more perfect union. And yet I know from my experience that the system tends to fight back, that the system itself is resilient and it absorbs blows to it in order to sustain itself. So I want to imagine with you in our short time together what a process might look like that would yield systemic change, because it also causes changes to the people that engage in it. Now, I understand that this is a time for disruption. And I heard a colleague recently who said, you don't fix the stairs of the Twin Towers while the buildings are still on fire. And I get that right now things are fired up. But at some point, it may be ripe to consider a public policy mediation process to think about police reform and community building. And I think it's incumbent upon us to be thinking about those possibilities now so that we are set to begin when it's possible to do so. I'm going to talk about only 3 aspects of process design. There are many components of it, but I think I'll give you a flavor by just talking about 3 parts of it. One question is, who would participate? The second is, what is a complementary goal? And the third is, how do we achieve what I've termed civic fusion? So first off, we need to think about a process for determining who would participate. I would immediately imagine, for example, city officials and police, and members of neighborhood associations and advocacy groups, students and teachers, parents and teenagers. But as Suzanne mentioned, we would first need to do a very thorough assessment to identify all the stakeholders and all the individuals that would need to participate. And it's also important to know that while there might be a representative set of negotiators that would reflect every segment of the community that was involved, there's also many ways to engage people who aren't at the table, right? So this is something that I refer to as outreach and consultation. We can innovate process mechanisms that enable people to participate in ways that are comfortable from where they are, and integrate what is learned from those broader levels of participation into the negotiations. I could imagine, for example, restorative justice circles or kinds of truth and reconciliation councils that would be happening simultaneously to a negotiated process, right? People who chose to might be able to tell their stories amidst their communities of support in the ways that were comfortable to them, not with voyeurism, but for people surrounded by those people that would provide them the love and support to be able to begin to heal from the pain and trauma that they've experienced. So in terms of who would participate, we would be thinking who might be the representative negotiators, who needs to be at the table so that every person affected by the process or the outcome would feel that there was somebody at the table that represented and understood their interests. But secondly, who participates away from the table? And how do those innovative process mechanisms get defined and built in order to create a productive process that would lead to an active and sustainable agreement? The second thing I want to talk about is a complementary goal. So we typically think about negotiations as having a primary goal to develop a written product, an agreement, a settlement, a policy, a regulation. But often we need to have a secondary or a complementary goal in order to make that agreement actionable and sustainable. So I'll use an example from an old case of mine that was in Chelsea, Massachusetts. Chelsea was a city that was put into state receivership because of fiscal mismanagement and corruption among their municipal governance structure. In order for them to come out of receivership, they needed a new city charter. But in order for that city charter to protect against future corruption, the people in the city needed to learn self-governance. They needed to deepen their understanding and capacity to participate in their own self-governance. And so the process was designed to bring together a set of representative stakeholders to negotiate the elements of the charter, but we also had a series of community meetings where we sent trained facilitators to people where they naturally meet in order to gain their input and understanding and feedback about what the city charter needed to accomplish. So the complementary goal is that intangible that needs to occur, needs to be built into the process design in order to broaden the participation and in order to make any agreement more actionable and sustainable. Finally, the third part of a process I want to talk about is what I've termed civic fusion. Civic fusion occurs when a diverse group of people is brought close enough together to bond to solve a shared public problem, even as they maintain deep differences in values, interests, and perspectives. An example I can give you of that was when I facilitated meetings among the leaders of the pro-life and pro-choice movements in Massachusetts after fatal shootings in my town in Brookline. We brought them together because the rhetoric at the time was violent-based. People were using the term justifiable homicide. And so as what happened in Brookline, somebody thought he could be a hero by shooting people and commit justifiable homicide. In this process, it was clear that the women who participated were never going to agree on when life begins, and they were never going to agree on the right to terminate, the right of a woman to terminate her pregnancy. However, they bonded very deeply with this deep difference intact to solve their shared public problem, our shared public problem of violent rhetoric on the issue of abortion. And they changed the rhetoric they used. They changed the rhetoric their organizations used. And they believe they helped contribute to a safer Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So to create civic fusion in our hypothetical process of police reform and community building, I can imagine there being a space for people to tell the stories of their lives disrupted and ended because of over-policing, of talk of the parent, about the talk the parents need to give their African-American sons about being stopped by the police, be respectful, keep your hands visible. But it would also make place for police to talk about their stories and their reflections. I remember a project I did on emergency response and Superfund site cleanups. Superfund sites are the most polluted areas in the United States. And firefighters told me about mission expansion, that when fire departments started, they were supposed to put out fires. And then over time, they responded to car accidents and medical emergencies. And now they need hazardous materials teams in order to respond to Superfund sites and industrial fires. I expect that we would hear similar mission expansion stories from police officers. I'd be curious to hear police officers speak about what it means to them to have had their forces militarized in the way we see on the streets now. I'd like to hear what they say about arresting mentally ill people, booking them, releasing them, and then getting called to arrest them again and again and again. Perhaps these close encounters would bring people together to bond around their shared problems. And in doing so, not only create an actionable agreement, but perhaps create some heartfelt change. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Wow, we have a lot to think about, and I suspect that those of you who are joining us today have a lot of questions for our panelists. We'd like to spend the remainder of our time allowing those of you who are here to ask the panelists questions. If you have a question, please type it in the chat box, and I will choose questions from the chat box to pose. If you have a question for one of our specific panelist, please be sure to note that in the chat box as well. So it looks like we do have a couple of questions here. Several of you have spoken or referred to work that you do with racial justice, and our first question is related to that. I would like the panelists to discuss their understanding of the term white supremacy and whether they use that term in their racial justice work. If not, why not?
So I'm very happy to provide an answer to this. I'm also very curious to hear what the other panelists think about this. So just to answer the first part of the question, what do I understand as the meaning of white supremacy? Simply that, white people are superior to other races, specifically Black people often, and that the system in which white people tend to dominate our institutions is therefore justified. I also think that white supremacy can also just simply mean that, observing a world in which white people do dominate our institutions and have more power within them in this way is therefore okay, right? That's not problematic, and I'm not going to try to dismantle that. In terms of the role that it plays in processes, I think that, to me, it's sort of what kind of language is appropriate and welcome in a process, and is it your job as a facilitator to sort of translate or change the language that participants are bringing that is their form of expression, how they choose to refer to and describe an issue. And in my mind, the answer has to be no. Our job as facilitators is to try to authentically represent and bring out the voices of all stakeholders in our conversations. And if the term white supremacy is for a stakeholder an accurate reflection and authentic reflection of their perspective on an issue, then it is our role to help them express that, not to get in the way of that. And of course, you know, to the extent there are other stakeholders that would feel differently about that term or find that term problematic, that is also a perspective that it is our job as a facilitator to allow into the conversation, to give voice into the conversation. And then to the extent that creates heat and conflict, that's our role, to hold that space and give people an opportunity to ask themselves, okay, why do I feel like this is problematic? Or why do I feel like this word needs to be in the conversation? Let's talk about that. And I think honestly, that is a great conversation in my mind. It's a challenging one, it's a hard one, but that is where I think our work can really lead to kind of deeper reflection among people.
Would any of the other panelists like to also discuss this or respond to anything that Toby has said?
I wholeheartedly agree with Toby on the things he's saying. And I think it's important for people to get comfortable being uncomfortable when they use these terms, and understanding that the term has both, you know, an interpersonal and a systemic, you know, meaning to it. And getting into that brave space where you can be open and feel uncomfortable is going to help advance the issues as we move forward, you know, as you collectively work together anyway. So what he said.
Great. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Toby. We have several really fantastic questions here. What advice do you have for engaging a group that does not see a need to engage? For example, a group of white leaders who don't see a need to address DEI in their organization, even though their Black POC colleagues express a need to do so. This participant says, I know Matt has great things to say about this, but I'm happy to hear from all.
Well, for me, when that comes up, it's seldom that I'm called in where this question doesn't at least hit the table about, you know, how we're going to approach this. Are there times where leadership, some people in leadership are saying that? I had the experience with an organization where one of their people on their board, one of their board leaders, in fact, was saying, you know, he knew they were important issues, but he just didn't want to talk about it. And fostering a discussion to bring in the voices of the rest of the board members to the point where it got to a position where they said, thanks, appreciate what you've done, and it's been a pleasure working with you. And they let him go, and he happened to be the largest donor in the group. But they said it wasn't working, you know, if they couldn't talk about it. But creating the space for other voices to get to the table when this happens, or asking the leadership, what frightens you about having this come to the table? Can you express that? What challenges you? And some will often say, well, I just don't think it's relevant. And yet it has come up from other areas within your organization. So are you going to ignore that? It's kind of like that ache you have when you're out running and you just ignore it and it turns out to be a broken ankle or something that gets bigger. Surely it will get bigger as you go along in your organization. And being, you know, trying to do it in sort of a friendly but confrontational way to keep the issues on the table is what I try to do. I'd love to hear from my colleagues how you do it. I have the luxury of being a Black man. Yes, I'm going to talk about this stuff. But I want to hear how my colleagues do it. Yeah.
So I can add a little bit. I think one of the things that we see as mediators is dynamics in front of our faces that are in front of the faces of parties, and yet they don't see them. So I think one of the things to do is to tell some stories. Like, do you remember when this happened? What did that look like to you? Or do you remember when there were a lot of people upset about this? What do you think was going on? And so to bring to awareness and consciousness some of the impacts of the problems within the organization that the CEO isn't looking at, and to cause them to become aware of those dynamics, and then to talk about how those might be addressed.
I had a colleague, a co-worker named J. Michael Hardy. He's still active. And he had an expression that I think is brilliant. He said, good process is no substitute for good leadership. It's leadership that's needed to identify the need for DEI that can envision that as being part of a future that we're moving towards. And I don't want to get overly grandiose about the role of the facilitator as being the person providing that leadership. Now, there are plenty of things that we can do within the role of the facilitator, but very context dependent, right? It's dependent on the situation. We may see a dynamic where some part of a group is afraid to raise an issue of racial equity, let's say. Others in a group afraid to engage the subject because, you know, they feel like it's a minefield and don't want to touch it. We can point out dynamics like that. We can provide coaching. I'm not opposed to coaching as a facilitator, helping participants shape and even rehearse what they might say in a group. So helping empower them that way to amplify their own voice, and helping provide as safe a space as possible for bringing up those really scary, unnerving topics. And I think racial equity falls into that category.
Susan, or Suzanne, I'm sorry, if I can stick with you for a moment. We have a question directed for you. This participant first thanks you for the lessons and takeaways at the end, but also asks, kind of on the flip side of what we've just been talking about, when you have a group who doesn't see need to participate, does not see a relevance, what if we have sort of the situation like you had with Peer, where folks have agreed that they want a certain group or you know, certain people out of the process? How do you address that? Is there a way or a time or a place to challenge the decision of the folks that are actively engaged in the discussion?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it gets to some ambiguity around how much does the facilitator have authority in determining who is and who is not at the table. And if you have different parties that disagree about who should be at the table, I mean, maybe the facilitator is the tiebreaker. But I think what I would have done in that scenario where the main parties didn't want Peer in is I would have pointed out the dynamic. I would have said, you know, my experience, which I didn't have at that time, is that a group like this, if left out of the process, will work very, very hard using whatever tools they have to undo what you're about, you know, what you're spending months here. More than a year, actually, they spent negotiating this new annual funding agreement. And so it's a choice. Include them now, you know, get them inside the tent pissing out, if you'll forgive the expression, rather than outside the tent pissing in. This is in the realm of process. And so I do feel I can make a recommendation as a facilitator about process matters. So I would say, final call is up to you, but I recommend including them in some way. Let's set up a meeting every so often along the way in the process where they can address you, chief negotiators, you know, the actual immediate negotiating parties, and share their perspectives and ask you questions and things like that. That's my recommendation. And you don't have to follow it, as long as you understand that I think what will happen is this, that they will seek to undermine what you do.
I think for a core planning team, that is essential, what you're saying, Suzanne, that you have to have those voices at the table, not only who can advance your issue, but who can block it, and being able to collaborate and get their issues and concerns on the table. Otherwise, whatever you create will be a mere shadow of what can possibly work. When everyone feels they have a voice or when they have been heard, you have a greater chance of advancing what your goals are in the first place.
Yeah, I agree with Matt and with Suzanne. One of the criteria for determining who has to be at the table is who can block the agreement, because if they can, they will. And sometimes we need to tell potential clients that it's not feasible to continue to the negotiating phase if we don't have everyone at the table for exactly what Suzanne said. We can have it, I mean, imagine doing an environmental case without any environmentalists, right? It's not going to be actionable and sustainable. And so in order to have an agreement that will be implemented, everyone who has a stake and everyone who can block an agreement needs to be at the table. That said, sometimes it's a complicated question. I remember with the abortion talks, there was a question about whether or not we should include a very extreme anti-abortion or pro-life group. And I consulted with a lot of colleagues about that because I thought we should at least consider including them. And the advice I got was because we weren't trying to build an actionable agreement, it was a facilitation as opposed to a mediation in my terms. It was okay to leave them out because they were threatening the process, not only whatever might come of the process. So it's a complicated question, but I do think on a mediated agreement, the fault line is, can they block it?
The next question, I'd love for panelists to talk about the challenge of neutrality. I know it's a topic that facilitators and mediators have been speaking about forever, and in that sense might feel exhausting, but at the same time, it feels more important than ever right now, especially in the highly polarized moment.
I can take a first crack. Because we've been talking about this in the field for a long time. I have to say, I don't even know what it would mean to be neutral. Like, what does that mean? And because for me, mediation is active. I'm not just kind of like a glass of water having people put stuff into me as water, which is a neutral substance. I have a different way of thinking about it. The way I think about my role is my orientation is to enable productive conversations that might not otherwise be able to occur. And so with that in mind, I am managing a conversation among people who are passionate about the substance on the table, the substance of the dispute. And I may have thoughts about it, but I haven't devoted my life to those issues. I've devoted my life to creating a space for productive conversations that couldn't otherwise happen. And so that makes it very easy to be outside of what I'm thinking, as opposed to inside the conversation. Now, that said, there are moments where it's very difficult to not want to jump in and say what you're feeling. And sometimes in very sensitive negotiations, it can be helpful to have a co-mediator or a co-facilitator, because if you get triggered, you can just step away and let somebody else jump in.
Yeah, if I could maybe just piggyback off of Susan, I think another element of the distinction for me, and I think Susan, you said it nicely, like as a mediator or facilitator, you're extremely active. And if you're not being active in managing the process, you're not doing your job. And I would just take it maybe a step further and say, part of our role, in addition to creating a good, productive conversation, is thinking seriously about the voices that are welcome in that conversation, that have access to that conversation, that are part of that conversation, and ensuring that underrepresented or silenced voices have a way in. So a lot of times in my role, I find myself kind of speaking with clients and saying, okay, what about these groups that kind of have an interest here, that want to be at the table? How can we make sure that they have adequate access here, right? That their voices, how do we make sure that they have the capacity to participate effectively? How much of our work together needs to involve actually kind of actively increasing that access and that capacity to ensure that this conversation reflects the full range of perspectives on this issue. So to me, that's what I mean when I say multi-partiality. I need to actively go out and identify voices that might otherwise be not able to be part of the conversation, and make sure that we are doing our part to address that.
Toby, you may be the right person to kick us off with this next question too. This participant is curious about how the panelists relate to cancel culture and an emerging leftist intolerance to public expression of right-wing views. It seems like this can be a shadow extreme of what Toby described as neutral is not neutral, fostering further tribalism rather than an empathetic emergence.
Yeah, I mean, really great question. And I think it's super challenging in these times, right? My quick answer to this is I think that we as facilitators need to have that same attitude in terms of voices from the right that might be silenced in different spaces, and making sure that we are doing the same active work to bring them in and welcome them and truly listen to their perspectives, especially if that means the conversation is going to be a lot harder, right? So I, as a mediator, I sort of see my role as the opposite of, or countering the cancel culture, right? I need to make sure that that doesn't happen on any side. And yet, at the same time, not sort of shying away from some of the hard truths that different people want to share, right? Making sure those have a place in the conversation from all sides.
I've been teaching in an academic setting for several years now, and I've had occasionally students who have, ripped me to shreds in an evaluation. So I've had one student rip me apart for being an imperialist and overly, conservative or something. But I'd had one student who ripped me apart for being too liberal and for supposedly not allowing conservative views. And I couldn't figure out who this was because whoever it was had never uttered anything in disagreement with me or other students that were expressing liberal views. I try not to express any explicit political views in my teaching. So I now begin every class by, in the first class, because this problem is endemic on campuses, I think in particular. I say first rule is every political point of view is welcome in my classroom. And secondly, no matter what your political views are, expect me to challenge them and expect others to challenge them. My goal is never to punish you for disagreeing with me or disagreeing with someone else. On the contrary, I intend to reward you for disagreeing and expressing that and engaging in open scholarly debate. So it does break my heart that it's on college campuses where we're supposed to be promoting open exchange of views that some people feel they should be silencing others. But it's also incumbent on those who think they're being silenced to speak up. You can't keep your views to yourself and then tell me that somebody else is silencing you. So I think there's responsibility all around for promoting that the environment that we need of open, respectful, but open debate.
Yeah, I've had the experience where someone says, how can you as a Black man let that voice, let that view hit the table and dominate the conversation? And then it's breaking it down about what time is actually being put into a view, how long have their views been repressed as they come to the table now, and saying it's better to know what the people you disagree with are actually thinking and feeling than to have it hidden. Just as yours was pushed away, should theirs be pushed away as well? And then there's a little disgruntlement, but people begin to see it. There's a sense of entitlement. Now it's our turn to be in dominance and to suppress the others, and getting past that and creating the space for people to be more open and neutral and be aware of what others are thinking.
So I would just add that these are what are now being referred to as worldview conflicts. And so we want to think about in our processes, how do we make people aware of the clash of worldviews? And so I've used a series of images to show kind of, here's a worldview, and let's identify them so that now we can understand not only the words coming out of someone's mouth, but the whole context from which something emerges. Right now, there's a Swiss group that's just initiated a big research project on worldview conflicts. And so I think within the next 6 months or a year, we'll have some more thinking about what are some of the tools and techniques and strategies for thinking about and managing worldview conflicts. So keep an eye out for that.
Can I just super quickly chime in one more briefly on this? I think another element of this as a facilitator is being very aware of the context in which you're operating and the extent to which that context might be more or less welcoming to different perspectives. And in some contexts, I think it is the case that people with more of a conservative or right-wing perspective are likely to feel less able to contribute, right? The water that you're swimming in that space might feel silencing to those people. And so that means your job as a facilitator needs to be especially attuning to voices that otherwise might feel silenced and finding a way to make sure that they feel welcome and able to bring their true selves. And I say that, and I have my own politics, right? I think it is to the benefit of all of us, right? If the true perspectives of people are feel welcome at the table, no one benefits if people feel like they can't say what they're actually thinking and feeling. Then we're not talking about what we really are talking about. And that's what the goal of the facilitator is. Let's talk about what really is going on, right? That's a good conversation.
And creating the space where that you're okay being in that discomfort for the moment so that the conversation can evolve from there. That's one of the big keys.
I think we may have time for one question that I think also sort of furthers the discussion that we're having right now. And that's, considering that our job as facilitators is to sort of transform the discourse and rhetoric and lead to sustainable change, this participant would like to hear what the panelists think about the issue of racism within the context of otherness, and whether racism should be approached conceptually and practically from the lens of merely racism or something more holistic, like a deep understanding of otherness.
I'll jump in. I think one of the things that's really important to me when I walk into a conflict is the specifics of difference. And I think when we talk about racism, we have to talk about racism. And we have to, we had 400 years of slavery. We had a New Deal that purposely did not allow African Americans to participate in. And so I think we need to really let that be what the focus of these discussions are, and where there may be other groups that that can have some empathy because they have they've also been oppressed in different ways. I think we need to talk about racism and be specific about the differences that have emerged as a result of racism in the US.
Thank you. I think we could go on for hours and hours, and we have so many more fantastic questions. I suspect that if we were together live, you would have an eruption of applause for the gratitude for everything that you've shared with us today and for what we've learned from all of you. Thank you so much. Oh, good, I see some people using their little applause things. I am going to just spend 20 seconds wrapping us up here. Let me just share my screen here. As we, I mentioned at the beginning, CNI is offering sort of a whole, realm of courses and opportunities to further dialogue. On September 6th, we'll have our next roundtable, and this time on the dispute resolution in the era of climate crisis. Next week, we have 2 webinars. We're rerunning 2 of our popular webinars that are kind of responsive to the time, the age of coronavirus. The first is on Tuesday, Keeping Peace in Home and Family, Navigating Conflict in the Age of Coronavirus. And the second on Wednesday, Strategies for Success in Virtual Negotiations, since everyone's had to move those negotiations to a virtual platform. In August, on the 13th, we will be offering a new webinar on leadership in times of challenge and change. So we hope that you will join us for one of these. And I'd like to, again, extend a huge thank you to our panelists, and also a thank you to everyone who joined us here today. Have a wonderful Wednesday. Take care. Be safe.